Hello, everyone, and welcome to So Very Wrong About Games, a board gaming podcast about board games. I'm your co-host, the third most important member of a two-man team, Mark Bigney, and with me, as always, is Kingston's favorite son, Michael Walker. How you doing, Walker?
The light, the one.
Wow. Delusions of messianic prophecy going on here.
Doing well, Mark. How are you this week?
I'm very well. I'm eager to talk about board games, because that's what we do here. We're going to talk about the AYURIS, the as-yet-unnamed retrospective intro segment, namely the game we reviewed last year. We're going to talk about the games we played last week. We're going to talk about the news and why it doesn't matter. And finally, our topic this week, which is sort of bittersweet, we're going to be talking about the works of board game designer Serge Laget, because he unfortunately passed away this week after a protracted illness. We're not going to be talking so much about his life, but more about the products that he made that touched our lives. So, Walker, what did we review last year?
Mark, 1 year ago exactly, we did a review of a game called The Red Cathedral. And it is a great sort of dice manipulation around the rondel, building up the famous Red Cathedral. And I still have it. And I still enjoy it. It is somewhat kind of my shelf of shame. There's a duo. See, I bought, there was a big expansion for Red Cathedral called Red Cathedral Contractors, and it's up there with Orleans Stories as the only two games that are on my shelf of shame.
Well, I would issue a minor emendation to your notion of it having a big expansion. Everything about the Red Cathedral is small, which is great. Small box expansion, very, very compact. I will say that having played Teletum and finding it relatively uninspired, and having played Woodwork and finding it, kind of overblown in a very traditional kind of Vladimír Suchý kind of way, that makes me more inclined to look favorably upon the Red Cathedral. I like it just fine. It's a pretty good resource manipulation Euro, but it's got a little bit more player interaction than those do, the competition for the different spires, and I'd be vaguely curious to see what they do with the expansion.
And that is Red Cathedral. Mark, what a great start to 2023. We played some very excellent games this week. Let's start with Autobahn. This is designed by designer Fabio Lopiano and Nestore Mangone. Published by Alley Cat Games. Alley Cat Games has been surprising me more and more every time. We played Cendrero. It wasn't great, but the production was fantastic. Had some interesting ideas there. They put out Internal Palace, which I've heard great things about. I definitely want to try it. Have you played Internal Palace yet?
No.
And Dice Hospital, which is not the best design of all, but it was very interesting. Dice manipulation gave you the feel of, rushing patients in and out of the hospital. And they have an upcoming Kickstarter, Arborea, which I have also pledged for. Like, a very colorful game.
That's an understatement, yes.
And now they've come out with Autobahn.
Also a colorful game.
It is very colorful, and it's historical. It's like oddly historical.
It is. I found that very intriguing. You start with the construction of the Autobahn, which is during the Cold War, and then it's a three-era game, and in Era 3, there's German reunification, and East Germany opens up. And that's neat. I like it when there's a little bit of historicity to the Euro game. There's a subtly propagandistic element to it, though. Very subtle. I don't think it's intentional. I just find it funny. It's almost as though what precipitates the fall of the Berlin Wall is that the Autobahn is almost completely finished in West Germany. And it's almost like the Eastern Germans are like, look at their highways. We must join them now. As I say, I don't think that's actually what the design intent was. I just find it funny.
Yeah, and you get to put little, it's a card action selection type game. You get to put out fuel pumps and do deliveries. You get trucks that travel along the Autobahn. There is lots going on in this game. Recipe fulfillment, all sorts of things.
Well, it's more route connection than recipe fulfillment.
I know there is some in there, though. True, route connection. That's true.
There's this idea that at the start of the game, you're given a couple cities, but it's less about connecting the route and more about upgrading the route as best as possible, because there's a variety of ways you can make the route better. Many of them are very expensive and or time-consuming and or difficult to do. Some of them easier than others. I would say that this is sort of Fabio Lopiano and Nestore Mangone kind of doing their impression of Alexander Pfister, because the card play reminds me a lot of an Alexander Pfister design. You're playing cards to various columns. The columns themselves can be upgraded by a variety of means. You're limited by what you can play where. They're color-coded. Eventually, you take the cards back. You're upgrading various parts of your board. So Fabio Lopiano initially came up on our radar with Kalamala, which is one of our favorite Euros of the past 5 years, I dare say. And I was disappointed by Ragusa because I thought it was had some of the similar elements that made Kalamal appealing, namely a somewhat clever action selection mechanism where you can draft, but I found the overall economy much, much less interesting, and what you were doing less interesting than the area majority struggle. If I didn't know that Fabio Lopiano had designed Autobahn, I wouldn't know. This doesn't feel at all like his prior games. It is much more rules intensive, much longer, and again, feels far more like an Alexander Pfister design. This is not to say that it's derivative, and this isn't even a criticism because I thoroughly enjoyed Autobahn. It's just very, very different from his previous work. The only criticism that I really have of Autobahn, I'm looking forward to playing some more, is that it's very long. It's a solid 2-hour experience, probably longer for your first play. And you're doing enough things, like you're building roads, you're upgrading roads, you're bedazzling the roads, you're trucking various things, you're looking at the map of Europe again and figuring, wait, where's that country? Oh, I don't know what that flag is. Look up the flag. Oh yeah, Sweden. Okay. And you're sending pharmaceuticals off to Sweden on these adorable wooden trucks with these adorable little wooden containers. I don't know how it would feel with more players. We only played with 2. And I had some disappointments there, in part because I felt like some of the challenges that the game was throwing at us were somewhat trivially hit. Like our routes were maximally upgraded relatively early. The board upgrades were relatively simple to come by. And I feel that with more players competing over the same stuff, because the structure of the game is there's a fixed amount of things to do, I feel that the competition might feel more intense and you might have to make more important trade-offs.
Yeah, and there's huge timing considerations. It's when to pass the routes, when to pick up your cards, because someone might, put a rest station down, before you can, or because, like Mark said, certain cards deal with certain routes, and you can look over and see they've played all their orange cards, so I can scoop my cards up now and be free to work on orange, and they'll have to waste a turn picking up, even if they do or do not. Very much enjoyed. Can't wait for more plays.
And I really like how focused the scoring is. One of the aspects that I focused more on, and I think you focused less on, was manipulating people in the overall administration and bureaucracy of the highways. It feels so very true to the Autobahn, and a lot of German stereotypes flying around here. And the timing there matters as well, because there's a fixed amount of spots, and sometimes you want to be in the lower offices, sometimes you want to be in the higher offices, and that feeds into one of the things that I often really like in the medium-heavy Euro games that I tend to prefer, is that the scoring is relatively focused. All of the scoring is in one place on the board, and you can just say, this is it. This is what we score at the end of the game, and that's all. And granted, that's a bit of an oversimplification, because what you do is you promote managers to a certain level, and those managers then cause various things to be worth various amounts of points, but it doesn't end up being a sprawling combinatoric mess so that you can't easily sort of eyeball what's going on and what you need to do in order to get points. Yeah, as I say, I'm looking forward to playing again. Looking forward to playing with 3. I don't know that I want to go jump straight to 4. As I say, it's very long. I would probably, certainly after playing with 2 players, I think I would have preferred a lot of time to be shaved off, especially the middle era. The middle era, we were kind of scrambling for things to do. We'd done a lot of the easy stuff we wanted to do. We were far away from doing all sort of long-term stuff, so there was kind of a paucity of middle-term goals. But with 3, possibly all our short-term goals that we accomplished in Era 1 will only be able to accomplish in Era 2, and I think that would really improve the pacing. So there's that. That was Autobahn by Fabio Lopiano and Nestore Mangone. Got to play some more games of Soda Smugglers. This is the Reiner Knizia card game by Bitewing Games. It's kind of sort of his answer to Sheriff of Nottingham, and it's certainly the case that everyone at the table, myself included, definitely prefer it to Sheriff of Nottingham. There's a fair amount of luck involved, but for an incredibly quick card game, it's hard to object too strongly. You're basically dealt 5 cards, and from those 5 cards, you select what 3 you're going to play, and sometimes you don't end up with quite a variety of what you're going to do round on round as a result. But there's lots of fun moments of hilarity where someone gets caught trying to pull a fast one and smuggle too much, and the inspector is specifically instructed in the rules that they have to sincerely apologize if they accidentally arrest somebody who has not violated the strict limits on soda importation. And so that's always good for some laughs, reminding someone that there has to be a sincere apology and talking about whether or not you accept the apology and this, that, and the other. Good fun. Much preferred to Sheriff of Nottingham, but a similar kind of bluffing, how much can I get away with, sort of manipulating the table. The other thing to note, though, about Soda Smugglers and its manipulation of luck, more on this later, is one of the great things that, the hallmarks of a truly great designer like Reiner Knizia is, even though it may be luck dependent, at least things keep happening. There are interesting moments, there are things to be done, the meta evolves, and there are interesting events, leading to greater friction and greater interesting interaction between different players. And that's definitely true of Soda Smugglers. If you end up with a draw that forces you to be incredibly risky, well then, that's going to lead to an interesting consequence, whether you get caught or not. If you're left with a draw that forces you to be incredibly conservative, the same thing applies. And so, of the 3 games in the so-called Criminal Capers collection, I think that Soda Smugglers is definitely the easiest sale, if for no other reason than the player count is very, very flexible, and it definitely has the greatest degree of social interaction of the 2 other games. That's not to say that I don't enjoy the other 2 games, the other 2 games being Poo Mafiosi and Hot Lead. I keep wanting to call it Hot Lead.
Hot.
Well, maybe I like that game better if Walker's going to narrate it. Anyway, Soda Smugglers, Reiner Knizia Bitewing Games.
I was lucky enough to introduce 3 new players to Woodcraft. This is designed by Ross Arnold and Vladimír Suchy, put out by Delicious Games. And I like how this played much differently than the other games I've played. We were really reduced of how much prestige points that we got from the orders, as in almost 0. So we didn't move up this track, so our orders were worth almost nothing, which led to very odd sort of game state. But still, they very much enjoyed it. In this game, you go up the reputation track, and you get to multiply that by how many orders you've completed.
Because it's not enough just to satisfy orders.
No.
You need to go up a track that then multiply.
There needs to be tracks.
I'm sorry.
There's so many tracks.
I'm sorry. My apologies.
I know, it's the only game that has tracks. I understand this.
I'm not picking on it specifically.
I know.
Jeez.
But I find it very interesting. They really enjoyed the dial mechanism of picking actions, rotating the wheel, or choosing certain actions and using tokens to actually do a different action. That was used so much in this game that I remember our first game, it was barely used at all. It was almost like, okay, what do these lanterns do? Like two-thirds of the way through, right? But always still enjoying Woodcraft. Was even luckier that I could leave it there by lots of people asking for it. So I was sure it was played a lot more. And that makes me happy. Woodcraft.
Played Chinatown by Karsten Hartwig. Chinatown is a kind of a classic of the negotiation genre. I'm not a huge fan of it for 2 reasons. I find that when it is being random, it's not being random in an interesting way. And near the end game, and there's a very small number of rounds, so the end game sneaks up on you pretty quickly. There's not really much grist for negotiation. Allow me to explain. I've said this before, but in the early game, you're just drawing random lots of property. And some people might end up with adjacent lots, which is what you want. This is doubly problematic, not just for balance reasons, but when you have adjacent lots, you cannot be persuaded to break them up. There's nothing that you would be willing to exchange it for other than other adjacent property. And so, again, contrast that to Soda Smugglers, right? Something random happens and the game state progresses in an interesting way. In Chinatown, a negotiation game, if somebody gets lucky, they're just not going to negotiate. If they get what they want from the bag, there's no grist for negotiation. So that's one knock on it. So that can apply to any number of the rounds in the game, because in Chinatown, you're constantly getting new stuff every round. In the end game, everything is open information, everything is deterministic income, and so you know exactly what everything is worth or potentially worth. So if I've got this tile that I know for certain is worth $20,000 to some other guy, it's like, okay, I'll sell it to you for 10, we'll split the money, we're done. Like, that's it. No real room for interesting negotiation, not real room for lots of interesting transactions. So, I mean, as a consequence, I find Chinatown pretty inoffensive as a game, but as a negotiation game, I think it really fails. The mechanisms don't lead to the kind of negotiation states that I enjoy. And you can have lighter negotiation games. That's fine. Indeed, Reiner Knizia has designed several. But they don't all have to be Sidereal Confluence. I completely understand that, but Chinatown just doesn't do it for me because I feel that the systems lead to stagnant game states and uninteresting deals. So I'm willing to play it because it's relatively quick, and if it's what people want to do, that's fine, and especially to make numbers, because again, Chinatown you want to play with 4 or 5. So there were 3 sad people trying to play Chinatown, and I'm like, all right, I'll make your dim sum dreams come true. And then, most insulting of all, nobody got to complete a dim sum restaurant.
Oh.
How offensive is that?
This is why I don't know why in my head I always compare Chinatown to Big City. Because it's the same sort of like trying to collect numbers that are adjacent to each other. But at least in Big City you get to put these nice, fancy buildings out on the board.
It's true. And Big City is less about negotiation and more about the underlying economics, which I think makes things better. So at that point, if somebody gets adjacent lots, interesting things get to happen rather than uninteresting things get to happen, at any rate. So again, I'm willing to play Chinatown, but it's not one of my favorites, and I don't think it particularly deserves its vaunted space in the negotiation genre. So that's by Kristen Hartwig. We played the Z-Man edition from 1999.
Lastly, for me, I got to play a Tiwa. This is the new design from Uwe Rosenberg, and it has bats. And Uwe Rosenberg never fails to sort of switch up, like using the same sort of ideas, but manipulating them in a different way. So not very much player interaction in this game. And the action selection is very, I don't want to say bland, but it's
bog standard worker placement.
And what you get is bog standard as well. But where the game shines is manipulating your board. You're trying to get fruit on trees. You're trying to get bats to go out and eat the fruit. You're trying to, train workers to be able to work with the bats, all of this stuff. I'm a little bit worried because on our first play, the scores were so close.
Yes.
I'm worried that the worker placement is one of those things where no matter what action you do, it's going to be 0.15 points, right? And so everything's going to cycle. I'm thinking there are ways that you can specialize in something and maybe run the points up. I'm not sure. More plays will let us know, I'm sure.
I share your concern. We had this moment of realization in the first couple turns of the game where we were looking down at the bottom of the very, very high value cards in Adiwa. And someone's like, oh, wow, that card's worth 10 points. And they're like, wait a minute, but in order to buy the card, you need to spend 7 points to get it. So you're really only gaining 3? Okay. And that definitely, I thought of that when we were finally tallying the scores. And I think the winning score was somewhere around 110, and the lowest score was somewhere in either the upper 90s or the low hundreds, couldn't remember. And that doesn't necessarily bode well. But I did have a great time in Adiwa managing my own little economy. And you're right, it's not so much about the worker placement. It's, do you have room for your bats? Do you have enough trees to hold all the fruit that in turn are related to how many bats you have to begin with? So it's this closed economy that you're messing around with, but having enough room for everything and being able to exploit what you have, and there are minor timing elements with the breeding considerations, all of that I found very, very, very enjoyable, and very much like every other Uwe Rosenberg game, slightly different than what he had done before, right? So you're not drowning in cards here for different professions. Here you have a lot of different landscape tiles, and they don't have as much personality, as, say, the professions or minor improvements of Agricola, but they're surprisingly neat. I got a baobab forest, and the trees there could host bats as well as fruit, or instead of fruit. And that was kind of cool. And there was a weird bat cave, and there was all the
haunted house.
The haunted house, and neat stuff like that. So it was surprisingly charming and effortless as far as Euro management games go. I have very mild misgivings about the way it frames the people of Ghana into trained and untrained, and the untrained ones are dirty, and the trained ones aren't. And I'm like, ooh, that just made me feel a little bit awkward as, a white Western dude playing around with Ghanaians. There was some concern before the game was published. Why is there a bat on the cover as opposed to an actual Ghanaian? Because, the other games all have like a picture of some white dude on them. But that, having played the game, it's all about the bats. Like, this is not a game really about people. This is mostly about bats. The people are incidental. So at that point, that concern went away. Flying away on the wings of a fruit bat.
Light and leatherly.
That was kind of beautiful. Well done, Walker.
No, it wasn't.
No, I think it was nice. And I was able to appreciate it despite the fact that on occasion I have mild flashbacks to the time I was attacked by a bat and had to get rabies shots.
No, that's not funny.
I don't know, kind of is. At any rate, it is the next Uwe Rosenberg worker placement game. It is not as tight as Agricola. It's much more loose. You do have to worry about feeding your family, but not even your family, but the villagers in your sundry villages. The pressure there is definitely closer to the Caverna end of looseness than the Agricola end of, oh my gosh, they're all going to starve.
I think it's even lighter because all of the things that you feed to the villagers aren't worth points.
Not all of them.
Most of them. Like
Well, when you have to feed goats and...
Goats only go up, by a point. Like, you're going to get points for them from getting them off your board in the closed economy. But even if you get them all back, you're only going to be out, 5 or so points.
Yeah, but that's if you've set yourself up properly.
True.
Like, in Agricola, if you've set yourself up properly, you're not going to have to worry about feeding your family ever anyway.
No, but in Agricola, I would say, like, the points you get for sheep in Agricola, gets pretty big the more sheep you get. Not so much here in
only a total of 4 if you get anyway. Well, we could quibble about that. It doesn't feel nearly as tight as Agricola, either in terms of the worker placement or in terms of having to feed your family. But there is, as I say, a delightful degree of variety in terms of the different landscape tiles that come up, and managing your little board of landscape tiles is delightful. So it is one of his lighter offerings, but certainly not as light as something as Reykholt, just to try to put it in terms of his other offerings. I think I had a great time. I'd happily play it again.
Looking forward to it. That is Ottawa.
Played a game of Eclipse, Second Dawn for the Galaxy. And this is absolutely, in spades, a session of a game that really highlights what we said in the review. I remember saying specifically when reviewing the second edition of Eclipse, that Eclipse is brilliant when it's not being stupid, and it's stupid when it's not being brilliant. And this session absolutely demonstrated that. The poor person who requested this play of Eclipse, the game tiles got amongst themselves and had a little bit of a discussion, and they decided they hated his face and they wanted him to suffer. He did not pull any planets in the first 2 rounds of the game. 0. And so he never had an economy at all. I don't think he did any serious misplays. And then, by round 3 or 4, when he just had enough pennies to scrape together to have a little bit of an expedition fleet, he ran the only way that this part might have been partially his fault, I don't know, I wasn't paying attention. The only way he could get back to the rest of the game was through me. And so then I'm like, well, I'm sorry, but no. And so then I got to build a fleet specifically to destroy his ships. That part was fun. No, the fleet design is amazing. If somebody could design a game of Eclipse where they just stripped out the exploration part, and then, of course, altered the other mechanisms to compensate, it wouldn't be a simple cut-and-paste job, but nonetheless had this degree of ship customization and building your fleets to spec and changing the customization of your ships in response to other people's technological development, I would be all over that. And that's one of the things that I really like about Imperium of Contention. You don't have that degree of customization, but you do have this idea of, I'm playing with toys in this lovely space sandbox. So very different games, but that's one of the things that I like about it, and you don't get hosed by the exploration in Imperium of Contention the way you do sometimes in Eclipse Second Dawn for the Galaxy. Despite that, everyone had fun, but I really did get the solid impression that the scores were entirely reflective of how good people's exploration pulls were in the first couple of rounds. Are there ways to compensate for them? Yeah, kinda a bit. But at the end of the day, ultimately, it's a very, very weak element of the design. And it's something that I wish someone could design out of it. And it's kind of part and parcel of a lot of the 4X genre when you have that kind of map. And it's one of the reasons why when games talk about how they have an exploration element, I'm like, I get very, very nervous. At any rate, a good time was had despite the problems, but there were absolutely problems. Eclipse Second Dawn for the Galaxy. It was a great week for party games. Played a lot of the old favorites. Codenames, Just One, Attribute. Played another game of Karate Tamati. The Reiner Knizia game that I wish was more like Beowulf, but isn't really, but it's still a pretty good game of Press Your Luck, and I was once again reminded that my copy of Karate Tamati used to be owned by Rudiger Dorn, so that's pretty great. Played Monikers for the first time ever, which means I'm very, very late to the party. I don't think I've ever played the sort of public domain parlor game Celebrities upon which it's clearly based. All that I can really comment on in Monikers was some of the choices seemed weird. Like there was a set of cultural references that didn't make sense to anyone at the table. There were references to memes that were really, really aged out. Like, it's just, why are you referencing viral YouTube videos? It's an odd set of choices. I don't know if in a different group it would work. This was a group of people that ranged in age from, I would say, early 20s to mid 40s. And there were a whole bunch of references that just completely fell at the bottom. That, like, some people were too young to get, some people were too old to get, and it just didn't work. Like, Katharine Hepburn, for example, as a reference, moving on from the social media or the viral video references, Katharine Hepburn kind of sort of works, because at that point, the youngins can get confused and think they're talking about Audrey Hepburn and start talking about Breakfast at Tiffany's. That's okay. I mean, not that Breakfast at Tiffany's is okay. Oh my goodness, I hate that movie. I hated it even before I was socially progressive. Even as a young racist child, I saw Breakfast Diffies like, people put this to film and then attach their names to it? What? Anyhow, setting all that aside, Monikers is great fun. It's a mainstay of the party game for a reason, I would suspect. Not necessarily for people who don't like high pressure and improvisational acting, but nonetheless a solid design. Designed by Alex Haig and Justin Vickers, who really are some of the kings of the party game sphere. They've done this, they've done Wavelength. They've also co-designed Spots with John Perry, king of the small box games. You're in for a good time when Alex Haig and Justin Vickers are attached to a project, I think. Published by CMYK in 2015, and there are innumerable expansions to be had, so you can kind of customize your set how you want. Suffice to say, if I had a copy of Codenames, I would definitely ditch all the ones that were references to YouTube videos or memes or what have you. Yeah. Of Monikers. Thank you very much. But this level of curation had not yet happened, so that's where there is. We also tried a party game called Herd Mentality. This is by Rich Coombs and Dan Penn, published by Big Potato in 2020. And this is because we're currently the overall zeitgeist mood of So Very Wrong About Games is very much Green Team wins. And Herd Mentality promises to be something like Green Team wins. It is not nearly as good as Green Team wins. It has solid Orange Team energy. That's what I'm saying. I didn't like the questions as much. The scoring elements are slightly more convoluted because in Green Team wins, everything gets to be explained by Green Team wins. It's like, what if there's a tie? Green Team wins. What if there's equal? Green Team wins. Stop it. And in Herd Mentality, you actually have to start asking these questions. And there's this cute pink cow that goes in front of somebody. It's the pink cow of shame. So I was hoping that there might be some sort of like subtle bullying element like Cockroach Poker. Right. Cockroach Poker is a game of bullying. It's true. Right? It's true. And so somebody could just sit there with the pink cow and we could mock them like they were a member of Orange Team. It didn't really shake out that way. So Green Team wins is better. Stick with Green Team wins. Herd Mentality was kind of cute, but Green Team wins is vastly superior. And finally for me, I played a game of Senji, but much more on that later.
Those are the games we played this week. Now on to the news and why it doesn't matter.
Sébastien Dujardin, operator of Pearl Games, has announced that Pearl Games is closing. Pearl Games is dead. Long live Pearl Games.
Because of course, this is right after we do a review of Kinkopolis the very next week.
Yeah, well, we don't really care about market forces. It's already been out of print for a while anyway.
I know.
Who
I'm
cares?
just saying.
I know. It's almost like this was the death knell. He was like, Asmodee was thinking, should we close down Pearl Games? Like, well, So Very Wrong About Games really likes Kinkopolis. Yeah, let's axe them. Not that they care. We are so far under their radar, it makes me happy. But anyway, yes, Sébastien Dujardin was a co-designer of Trois, and Kinkopolis was published under Pearl Games. Most recently, Time of Empires was published by Pearl Games. Time of Empires we both find delightful. A little bit uneven in terms of design elements, but a very, very fun real-time experience. And Asmodee acquired them a few years ago and now has shut them down. However, Mr. Dujardin has preserved the intellectual property and the rights to all the old IP, and so he is considering whether or not he's going to resurrect Pearl Games in some form. This, I think, is just another consequence of consolidation. Like, Asmodee just buys up all these studios, and at the time, there was all this talk about, oh, don't worry, we will preserve them as independent studios. Like, sure, unless and until you decide to close them. So the level of independence here is obviously not total. Anyway, I've enjoyed my time with Pearl Games in the past. We're huge fans of Kinkopolis, and I enjoyed experimenting with things like Black Angel and Trois, and I really like Time of Empires. And so it's kind of sad to see them go, and I hope they come back.
We didn't stream any games this week, but I did do a big sort of Uwe Rosenberg unboxing segment where I unboxed the new Agricola 15 and Ottawa and all the other stuff for Agricola, like Farmers of the Moor and the new expansion for Caverna. All of these things, if you're interested in any of those, check out the stream. We also put out the video for our top 10 of 2022 is now available to watch. I thought it was pretty damn good.
Walker says Walker is good, says Walker. Tom Jolly, venerable game designer, but also co-designer of the recent Cryo, of which we're big fans, co-designed with Luke Laurie. One of his original classic designs is Wiz-War, which was published, shall we say, back in the day. And it's been published by various publishers, including most recently by Fantasy Flight, but now it is currently on Kickstarter for a, 12th edition. They've stopped counting. It's kind of like the Fast and the Furious movies. If you have to count, you've missed the point. And it is not really a definitive edition, but they don't plan on publishing more expansions for this. They've gone sort of a back-to-basics, bare-bones approach. And so if you're interested in exploring one of the classics, then it is up on Kickstarter now, being published by Steve Jackson Games. Wiz-War is sort of a free-for-all manic experience of flinging spells at each other and melting each other's faces. And indeed, when I talk about Black Rose Wars, and I'm a big fan of Black Rose Wars, I say it's kind of like Wiz-War, but slightly more calibrated to my preferences. So I definitely appreciate the lineage of Wiz-War, and I think everyone should at least experience it once if you have the chance. So that's Tom Jolly and Steve Jackson Games publishing Wiz-War on Kickstarter. Also available as of this recording is a one-player vidya game called King's Dilemma Chronicles. And I have not yet had a chance to play this yet because they want, money. But it does look like from the trailer that it has some of the elements of the King's Dilemma campaign. So if you have enviously listened in to people talking about the King's Dilemma and how amazing it was amazing. I highly recommend you check out King's Dilemma Chronicles because it at least shares the world and some of the touchstones of the awesome things that happened in our campaign of the King's Dilemma. That is the news and why it doesn't matter.
Now on to the topic of the week, which is Serge Laget and the great games that he left us.
This is one of those occasions where, I have my favorite designs of Serge Laget, and we will absolutely talk about that. But going through his catalog, I had completely forgotten some of his tremendous contributions to the hobby in terms of his designs. And I think that it's worth starting, with possibly his single greatest mechanical innovation into the hobby, if you don't mind. And that is his co-design with Bruno Catala. He co-designed a lot of his designs with the two Brunos of European design, Bruno Faiduti and Bruno Catala. And in 2005, Serge Laget and Bruno Catala co-designed Shadows over Camelot. Now, keep in mind the context here. This is 3 years before pandemic, right? So the modern era of co-op games were kind of in their infancy, sort of rejuvenated by 2000's Lord of the Rings by Reiner Knizia. And Shadows over Camelot was, I think, the first major design to have a trader element. That particular way of doing semi-co-op, which is a way of semi-co-op that I really adore. It's not the 1v-all version of having a dungeon master or something, but having a trader element. It was completely revolutionary, and it knocked everyone flat on their asses. And that tension that he introduced into the sphere is, still felt today. Like, so many designs leverage that exact idea. And just look at all the different modes of game that have done this. Like, this is X, but with a hidden trader, right? Yeah. Trick-taking, auction games, you name it. They're all there. And I think they can all be traced directly to the contribution of Catala and Laget.
Yeah, I think it's one of the very first big co-op games that hit the market. The ones that, that flooded the market. Lots of them were out there. And nice, accessible, fun. I remember all my times with Shadows of Camelot being fantastic.
I remember the tension. I don't, the rest of the Shadows over Camelot stuff didn't really appeal to me. Like, prior to pandemic, there isn't really a co-op that I really thought really shined. But I do remember the tension and just the thrill of this idea of someone among us possibly working against it. And it's something we take for granted now. Almost everybody, even a relative newcomer to the hobby, is familiar with, there's a hidden trader. And sometimes they even get disappointed when there isn't. And so, again, in terms of, mechanical innovation, in terms of bringing somebody to the genre, I think he completely changed the hobby. So, in terms of that design alone.
My first introduction to his designs was Mare Nostrum back in 2003. It was very much a civilization game. It had the same sort of trappings of collecting all these different, ingredients to get a bonus, trading them with all the other players, trying to get sets of stuff. It was a big, war in the Mediterranean type game. Lots of, frilly hats and frilly helmets.
Roman, sure. Yeah.
Greek soldiers and Roman soldiers and how do boats work and all of those things. And then later on, more than 10 years later, he had a huge Kickstarter to bring out, very much the same game, but with a bunch of extra stuff.
Yeah. Mare Nostrum Empires was published in 2016. And yeah, there was extra stuff, a lot of rebalancing. Some of the expansion from Mare Nostrum mythology was involved in the base game of Mare Nostrum Empires. 2003 was, that's when it was first published indeed. And it was very much a game of its time, because in the early aughts, everyone was trying to design Civ Light. At the time, being the young hobbyist that I was, I didn't even really know what that meant, because when you call something Civ Light, that could mean any number of things. Like, as we talk about all the time on the show, civilization means different things to different people, right? And what Serge Laget was doing was very much like a sort of more pure version of Civ Light. He wasn't trying to do a more playable version of Sid Meier. He was trying to do Tresham's Civ in a 2 to 3 hour experience. And at the time, I wasn't in a position to appreciate that because I hadn't yet played Tresham's Civ. Because when you're talking about civilization in that mode, you have to have the trading, you have to have the text, you have to have the one blah, 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 blah. A lesser designer, of course, would regard it as a series of tick marks, right? But so many contemporary designs are like, oh, this harkens back to the classic tradition of Civ games, and then they produce a game that doesn't have any trading in it. It's like, okay, that's fine. That doesn't make it a bad game, but that doesn't harken back to the classic tradition of civilization games because, trading is a necessary aspect of that. And so the fact that Mare Nostrum and Mare Nostrum Empires in a 2 to 3 hour experience get all those things out is impressive. I found them fragile. For what it's worth, but certainly from a rules perspective and from a systems perspective, I thought they were great. So did you have any experience with the reprint?
No.
Because I only played it a couple times. The components were great. I thought the rebalancing was really good. And the trading aspect definitely threw people for a loop. Because again, here we are, 13 years after the original publication, where the Sid Meier mold was now, by far the dominant understanding of what Civ games look like. And someone's like, why are we doing all this trading?
I didn't buy it myself. I did play it though. Of course, the Winnebago picked it up because that was definitely one of his favorite games. So I did get to play with the nice new clay chips that came with the new version.
Ooh. Yeah, no, I didn't go that far. I had a copy from the Kickstarter. I did get all the clay chips though. Most recently, and so Mare Nostrum is somewhat unlike a lot of his other designs that we're going to be talking about in that he designed that by himself. Well, by himself. Of course, there were playtesters in it, blah, 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 blah. But there's no co-designer listed for Mare Nostrum. And there's also no co-designer listed for his, I think, most recent surprise hit, Devir, which was published in 2020. We've talked about it a lot on the show. Fabulous, accessible auction game. You can play it on Board Game Arena.
Yeah, it came out with 2 expansions. I played it a ton on Board Game Arena. Great sort of set collection, I guess you could say, in a way. I loved it.
And a great sort of hearkening back to sort of classic Euro design minimalism, right? Not a sprawling sea of spreadsheets and this, that, and the other. It's like, no, you're just going to do some auctions and get some set collection.
Yeah, quick auctions, quick card choices. You get, even especially on Board Game Arena, you knock games out in no time.
Oh, yeah. But nonetheless, I should say, despite I don't mean to minimize it, despite the fact that it was hearkening back to a sort of a classic Eurogame aesthetic, it nonetheless had sort of more modern innovations in the form of an almost effortless form of deck building. Not quite deck building because you're not a deck, but just the way you would upgrade your coins over the course of a game of Devir at practically no rules load and practically no opportunity cost in terms of doing things. You just constantly get to make these economic trade-offs that might or might not improve your economic fortunes going forward. And that in particular was the aspect of Devir that I liked the most. The toys were nice. The eking out additional funds and this, that, and the other and trying to outthink people in the blind bidding was nice. But just the supreme effortlessness with which the economic improvement was embedded in the game made me very, very happy.
So another game from back 2009 is called Ad Astra. And this is sort of, I think, Mr. Laget's and Bruno Feduti's sort of reply to Catan. This was sort of like Catan in space. You're making all these different planets. It played a lot differently, but it had the same sort of feel. Things trigger, and if you had presence on these different planets, then you'd get resources, and you spread out to different planets, get more resources. Had the same sort of progression that Catan did. I remember enjoying it very much.
I remember playing it when it came out. I loved the artwork. It was one of the, and again, this was in 2009, so Euro graphic design hadn't really hadn't really started mirroring some of the design elements of more Ameritrash games at the time, sort of dark science fiction, comic book style art, things like that. We were still mostly Franz Vohwinkel and artists like that, whom I love, but definitely have a different aesthetic when compared to a lot of the dark palette science fiction stuff. It's going to be reprinted this year, actually, under the title Artemis Odyssey. And I'd be interested to see that it's got a different listing under Board Game Geek. So by implication, there's at least some suspicion that the rules might have been changed. And that's actually one of the when Bruno Faiduti, who is one of his close co-designers, that's actually one of the things that he was talking about in terms of when he was discussing his death. It's like I've been reaching out to him about reprints for both Ad Astra and for another game that they did together, which we'll probably talk about very shortly. And that's what clued me into some of these designs were getting republished. And so that I'm looking forward to trying it again with new eyes.
So the last game for me, at least, it would be Senji, which I'm sure we're going to talk about quite a bit. It is this great sort of trading relatives around board presence, has this very, I really love the dice, how the 6 different factions in the game, and for fights, for ties, for almost any conflict in the game, you're rolling these dice, looking for your symbols. Mark, what do you think of Senji?
So Senji was published in 2008, and I am hard-pressed to think of any game, Troops on a Map or otherwise, that has a better integration of mechanisms than Senji does. That's one of the things that I frequently criticize games for. I feel like they sprawl in ways that I find unpleasant, and nothing's connected, and they're not really points of intersection. A great example of that would be, even to pick on a designer I really like, would be Witchstone, right? There's this action selection mechanism that might trigger a certain number of actions, but any given action you do is entirely disconnected from any other action you might be doing. Senji, everything is deeply connected, and it all redounds to negotiation. And that makes me so desperately happy. It's been on my top 20 nearly since I ever got it. I think it was the first game I ever translated, because it's mostly language independent except for the samurai power. So I remember getting a copy in 2007 when it was published in French and just making paste ups for all the samurai and subjecting it to all my Anglo friends. And Senji's a masterwork. I mean, honestly, when talking with people who have a great deal of respect for Troops on a Map games done well, Senji still has a lot of regard. It comes up here, there, and everywhere. It's not widely regarded, but I think it's highly regarded by those who know and care. Anyway, so that is a preface.
And it gives me the feel when you watch all these feudal Japan shows and or movies, it almost lets you reenact that because you make alliance with someone.
Yeah.
And you're friendly throughout the whole game. and you're trading cards and it's lovely. But in the background, you're siphoning his cards off to
their cards.
Siphoning their cards off to their opponents.
Yep.
And suddenly he realizes that you've given up, everything against him, and it's so excellent.
All right, so to give a sort of sense of what's going on, every year is divided up. Every round of the game is a year, and it's divided up into 4 seasons. There's winter, where you negotiate. There's fall, where you put out your orders. Summer, where you execute your orders. And autumn, where you do some economics. And there's this giant sand timer. Lasts about 4 minutes. You flip that, and that's negotiation. And you're encouraged to leave the table and cut deals. Everybody has a deck of diplomacy cards. Slightly different distribution of different cards, but roughly they shake out to the same values. Your cards are useless to you, except in the form of trading them away to other players. And key amongst this are your relatives. These are hostages that you can hand to other players. The idea then is, and this is just a small gesture to how tightly everything is intertwined. If I give Walker one of my hostages, and then I attack Walker, the first thing that happens in the battle declaration procedure is Walker can execute this hostage. It's very embarrassing for me. It's a solid green team flex for him, and he gets points, and I lose a bunch of points, and it's bad. Here's the problem. If I give Walker one of my relatives, I can't be sure that it's going to stay with Walker because they all have the same card back and nobody knows where they end up. Walker can trade them to somebody else for who knows what. And so I might go off and attack somebody else, and Huey's like, oh, your grandma's not going to like this. Like, how is grandma with Huey? It's utter genius, and it's just one of those ways in which it maintains a constant sense of paranoia, because it gives you this illusion of security. It's like, a very common trait at the start of the game is, I'll trade you a relative, you trade me a relative, we won't attack each other. Nope, no guarantee.
Yeah, it sort of gives you that diplomacy feel, the fact that you can leave the table, cut deals, make up any stories you want. Well, I traded him the card, Mark. He promised me that he wouldn't use it against you. It's not my fault.
Yes.
I just really needed that boat.
Yes, you can trade economic support, military support, and relatives. And it's a relatively simple set of interactions. But again, the way they touch almost every other element of the game. So there's the economic model of the game, which in Senji means you're incentivized to hold lots of territory in order to give economic production. But if you're producing lots of economy, you're giving up the chance of getting more certain points, or indeed higher number of points doing other things. This is one of the traps that new players, or at least risk-averse players, sometimes fall into. It's like, I'm a turtle up. And
there's troops on the map. That means I got to control everything.
Yes. And this is indeed one of my only substantive criticisms of Senji, and that is it is a bit fragile. It is mostly subject to fragility when people are making suboptimal decisions, especially those suboptimal decisions that are imported from other troops on a map game. And I remember one session in particular where somebody saw the opportunity to take over 3 territories at once, and did so, and thought that this meant because they had 5 territories now and everybody else had like 2 or 3, they were going to win. They came in last. Because if you're doing an order that doesn't immediately generate you points, you're wasting time, because Senji is quick and brutal, and if you don't know exactly where you're going to get those points, you're in trouble. And the economic production dovetails with diplomacy, because there's a way to trade boats to other people, which helps you complete these sets. And then during the autumn, you cash in cards for points in a variety of different ways. It's just, it sounds like there's a lot going on, and there kind of is, but again, it hangs together so perfectly that from just a design perspective, it's a thing of utter beauty. To say nothing of how fun it is to play, because I played Senji just this weekend, and again, it was one of those situations where everyone at the table was like, this is so good.
Yeah, because it all revolves around that same deck. So as soon as you understand what the deck does, then it all sorts of makes sense. Like these other games that have 15 different decks that you have to sort of figure out and understand what they do, and you, so much randomness off the top. This is the same deck, and you know... Well, I shouldn't say you know where your cards are going, but your cards are out there.
You can hope.
And things will happen.
Yes. And some people get a little tripped up with, again, trying to import other conventions from other games. Like one of the things that surprises people when playing Senji is how brief the game is. It's going to last about 90-ish minutes, 90 to 120. But the way it's set up, you figure it's going to last like 6, 7, 8 rounds, but it doesn't. It lasts usually, I say, around 4 to 6, sometimes 3 to 5, and that takes people by surprise again. But that just emphasizes how much it's not about holding on to dirt. So many troops on a map game fall into this. Like, your goal is to hold on to dirt. It's like, there's a lot of problem with that, turtling and all manner of other things. And so, just above and beyond the fact that it's a work of beauty from a design perspective in terms of integration, it also just solves a lot of the troops on a map problems effortlessly. Like, another problem is the map. We've talked about how in Kemet, you're teleporting around and everyone's within equal distance of everyone else. Well, playing Senji, you're stuck with, the shape of Japan. There are these islands. And
no teleporting portals? No.
There are no teleporting portals.
Oh.
Instead, you have boats.
Boats.
You can...
How do boats work, Mark?
It's lovely. You can either launch a raid by going to any other sea zone in the same turn at a risk, or you can do so more slowly and not at a risk. And again, so you have this simple trade-off, the simple tension about being able to interact with anybody at the table militarily, but you have a sort of concentric circles of fear, right? The neighbor that you have right next to you that's amassing a force that you haven't traded family members with, you're most concerned about them. But that person way at the other end of the island that you thought you traded hostages with, they might knife you too. You're less concerned about them, but they might show up at the wrong time, or vice versa. And, so... As I say, the only serious problem I have with Senji is sometimes people play suboptimally, and I can understand why, because it looks like a lot of lesser designs. And if you start playing it like you were playing those lesser designs, sometimes the game state can get a little bit unsatisfying. But when you've played it the first time and you recognize it for what it is, a brutally efficient game of point maximization and betrayal at the right time, it's just utterly unmatched, I think, in its sphere. I honestly think it's my favorite Troops on a Map game. I don't think it's seen its equal in terms of cleverness of negotiation since its publication over 15 years ago. It's just a masterwork, honestly.
Yeah, it does lead into that problem. As soon as you see it's sort of a war game, because a lot of war games break down to sort of like a poker tournament. You think that there's going to be one winner, and it's all going to go down to the last wire as soon as like one person masses enough troops to take over the whole thing. And this is the exact opposite. Like you already said, it's not going to be resolved on the map. It's going to be resolved by making sure you're getting points on every turn.
Right. Because, and just one thing about the battle resolution system, because the battle resolution system, although sometimes fluky with respect to dice results, dovetails so beautifully with the diplomacy. I may be the better tactician, and I might have outmaneuvered you and attacked you where you didn't suspect. But if you have more friends than me, even in the context of that single fight, you might lose. So every die has a facing for each player, whether they're in the game or not. And you just pitch all the dice, and some of them are going down to the benefit of the players involved, right? If yellow is fighting purple, you pitch all the dice, you set aside all the yellow dice, you set aside all the purple dice. But then what's left is you're going to have some red, some green, some black, some blue. That's where you play the diplomacy card. You call in favors from opponents. Like, oh, I play this card that says all these black dice are now mine for this round of the fight. I win because you didn't negotiate well enough, even though you came at me with a superior force. It's marvelous, and again highlights the extent to which whatever you want to do, whether it's military, whether it's economic, you have to set it up during the diplomacy phase, or you might end up completely outmaneuvered. It's glorious. So yeah, I love Senji so much.
Senji,
yeah, it's nominally a 3 to 6 player game. I don't recommend it with 3, but I've played it several times with 4 and 5, and it's great. It's actually subtly different when you're playing with 4 or 5 as opposed to 6, because as I said, every faction's participation in the game is crucial. The game doesn't work unless all colors are represented, and there's this kind of auction system to win cards of players not in the game. Some people prefer it. With 6 players, if you're good at making lots of deals, there's going to be lots of fluidity, and lots of cards from all players are going to be floating around. And so you can score lots of diplomatic points. 5 players, oof. That 6th player that's not in the game, their cards are going to be rare and sought after. Some people prefer that tightness. I don't know. I just find it interestingly different. Same thing with 4 players. It's a little bit, it's tighter than with 6, but not quite as tight as it is with 5. Anyhow. The last thing I'll say is that apparently there's going to be a reprint of Mystery of the Abbey, also co-designed with Bruno Faiduti, which is sort of their gamely version of Clue. I don't know if you have any experience with that.
I do not.
Anyway, it's surprisingly thematic in a lot of ways. It's got things for Vespers and like Vows of Silence and stuff like that. It's very cute. And it's one of his earliest published designs. It came out in 1995. And I just wanted to give a hat tip to that. Because it might again be in publication soon. It's a shame that Senji isn't in circulation. As I say, those that know it speak very highly of it, and I know a lot of designers who think very carefully about a lot of the problems of Troops on a Map games, and Senji just either solves or overcomes them with such effortless brilliance. And it's, as I say, it's one of my favorite games of all time, and it's just so well done. And I think it's a testament to his genius and to the talents of his co-designer, Bruno Catala. And that was my first reaction when I heard that he was dead. I was like, oh, I guess we're never going to get another version of Senji. Or maybe it'll get republished. I don't know. But it won't get redesigned by the designers. And so that's
I do want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. I just want to mention his first design, which is
Le Gang des Tractions Avant. I've never heard of that.
Oh, that was his very first design, and I just want to mention because he did so many co-designs.
He did.
This one was co-designed with Alan Munoz, and then he decided no more Alans, Bruno's only. And because I've never seen any designer like Serge Laget that co-designed so many times with almost everything that he's done.
A lot of the Italian designers do that, right? That's why I call them the Italian masters, because they collaborate so much. You know, the Lucianis, the Battistas, the Chiarvesios, they tend to co-design as a rule. And some French designers do the same, like Bruno Catala, for what it's worth, also co-designs with a lot of people. And same thing with the people who worked for Pearl Games, a lot of those individuals, like Alain Urbain or those. It's a very common European tradition. I have to imagine that it's because a lot of the, if you can go to some of the bigger French game clubs, you're just going to rub elbows with a whole bunch of really, really talented people. And, Serge Laget was one of them.
True. I suppose in a way it happens in North America as well. It's just the fact that a lot of those games don't get any design credit, right? Because it comes out of a big publishing house where all of the designs are sort of in-house. And
that's true.
They don't give
That's true. Yeah. Like a lot of, or even just a lot of those old Games Workshop products that were really came to fruition in the in-house Games Workshop shops, and they didn't give credit to anybody at all. So yeah, that's a good point. Anyway, I've had a tremendous amount of joy playing a lot of the designs of Serge Laget, and so I was very, very sad to hear of his passing. And I hope that those of you that have not played any of his games take a chance. I mean, it's available on Board Game Arena. If you want to try Nidavellir, it's available for you, and I recommend it.
I'm so glad he gave so much joy to so many people with the games that he designed.
Absolutely. Very well put, Walker. And that's going to do it for this week. Thank you very much for joining us for So Very Wrong About Games. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can find all our contact information at sowronggames.com/contact. We read everything you send us and we'll get back to you if we can. Thank you so much for spending time with us, and we hope to see you again soon. Peace!
You've been listening to So Very Wrong About Games, produced by Michael Walker and edited by Mark Bigney. Special thanks goes to What Does It Eat for generously allowing us to use their most excellent song, FOS, as our theme. You can find them at whatdoesiteat.com. You can reach us by email at soverywrongaboutgames@gmail.com or on Twitter at SoWrongGames. Thanks very much, see you next time, and always, try to be right, but remember you are so very wrong.